Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Ecological and Mormai people of the land upon which we're meeting. My name is Jason Van Tol, and my presentation is called The Youth Understandings of Economic Growth and Ecological Sustainability. So I'm going to return to former times of presenting papers, and I'm actually just going to mostly read the paper. As I mentioned, I didn't bring a laptop. But a focal point of my PhD is the conflict between economic growth and ecological sustainability. And ecological economists have been arguing for over half a century now that these two processes are in conflict. And for the theoretical framework for my study, which is cited in the abstract for this presentation, and it's called A Social Ecological Model of Education, I argue that economic growth requires, or at least is closely coupled with, increasing resource use, and that ecological sustainability requires, at a minimum, limiting resource use. Okay. And hence the conflict. We cannot increase and limit resource use at the same time. That's the basic idea. So in other words, the economy cannot grow forever. It has limits, many of which have already, in various literature, have already been breached in terms of biodiversity loss, climate change, overextension of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, and so on. So in teaching about the environment and sustainability, I think it ought to take account of this conflict and the worldwide commonplace policy of growing the economy. Every country in the world that I have ever looked at, in both the global north and south, since the end of World War II, has been trying to grow their economy, and they still try to do that today. And so, if we're going to teach about this, it seems that we should first ought to know what the young people actually know about it. What does this mean to them? Each of these two, admittedly, quite abstract concepts. And yet, as cited in the abstract for this presentation, young people's understanding of economic growth is, quote, virtually non-existent, and others have suggested a qualitative study would be useful in fulfilling this important research gap. So it's within this context that I did the following. So between September 2024 and April of this year, I interviewed 12 young people between the ages of 18 and 24 in Australia, online via Zoom, and I asked them for their views of economic growth and separately ecological sustainability. And then later on, I asked them if they thought there was any conflict between these two, and also if they thought there was any limits to economic growth. So I then did a thematic analysis of their responses using this social ecological model that I mentioned to help generate the themes. And here I'm only going to present the findings of what these two processes meant to them. And these initial questions about what economic growth and ecological sustainability meant to them. And it has been in the abstract for this presentation. The paper was under review, and 2 weeks ago it was accepted. And it has been accepted, but it hasn't been published yet, but I'm hoping any week now. And I'm working on a follow-up paper that will present what they actually think about the conflict between these two. So here's what I found. And maybe since this has gone up, I'll just use this. So first, for economic growth, it meant one of 6 things to them. And the order in which I'm going to write these is by prevalence. So the ones that occurred most often count first, and those least last. So the first thing that one more thing is the key analytical question was, what do the young people think is increasing? Right? If economic growth means anything, something's got to be increasing. What is it? So the first thing that they said was increasing money. And this included not just money, but things denominated in money, prices, profits, wages, inflation, things like that. The next thing they said was increasing resource use. That was the next thing they associated or thought economic growth meant to them. The next thing was increasing employment or jobs, followed by increasing well-being, and for the last two, at a given scale, they are logically opposed to one another, but in the paper itself, I show how they can, the last two can occur simultaneously at different scales. So the second last one is increasing inequality. And then the last one, which doesn't technically mean the same thing, but they used it to mean the same thing in the opposite way, was increasing equity. So those were the 6 themes that emerged from the analysis. That's what economic growth meant to young people. As for ecological sustainability, it meant one of 5 things. And again, I'm going to present it in order of prevalence. The first thing, and the key analytical question for this process, which is the goal in the model that I mentioned, the key analytical question was, how do they think ecological sustainability should be achieved? Right? So the first thing they said was, the first way this can be achieved is by limiting resource use. Limiting resource use. The next thing was by technological development. Development. And the next one I called remedial actions, which basically just means any action that is aimed at cleaning up or restoring the natural environment. So that was the third means by which they thought ecological sustainability should be achieved. And the second last one was through education. And the very last one was by reducing power imbalances. These were the 5 means by which they thought we should achieve ecological sustainability. So I'm just going to pause for a moment just to let you take that all in. And now I'm going to talk about, what does this all mean? And how is it important for us as environmental and sustainability educators? So the first thing I think is that this is all quite complex, right? I mean, these terms mean a variety of things to young people. And as I say, they're both quite complex, but more specifically, however, is that depending on which one of these meanings young people have in their minds, these 2 things may be either conflicting or they may be compatible. For example, readily apparent is that increasing resource use is going to be at odds with or conflicting with limiting resource use, just as I have described in the introduction. We can't increase and limit resource use at the same time. But there are other examples as well. So for instance, if young people think that economic growth means increasing inequality and ecological sustainability means reducing power imbalances, then again, they will probably perceive these 2 things to be in conflict. Now on the other hand, if they take economic growth to mean increasing money, which is the most prevalent result, and ecological sustainability to mean technological development, then there will probably be no such conflict. Right? Banks can just create, through the money-making process, as much money as they want and direct it towards technological development. There probably won't be any conflict. And likewise, if economic growth means increasing employment or jobs, and ecological sustainability means remedial actions. And again, they probably won't perceive any conflict. They'll think these two things are compatible. Governments can just create job programs against people to clean up the environment, and there's no problem. However, for us as environmental and sustainability educators, I argue in the paper that the most important relationship here is the one that I highlighted at the beginning, and that I've drawn on the board here, is that I'm suggesting that we focus on this particular meaning. Economic growth is increasing resource use, and ecological sustainability is requiring some collective imposition of limits on resource use. And in fact, in the paper, because this relationship is so important, I give it a name, and I just call it the resource use conflict. Resource use conflict. And so this is not to say that the other meanings are unimportant. They are important. And in the published paper, I suggest some ways that educators can address these other meanings, especially in relation to the resource use conflict. And I'd encourage you to read the paper and see if you think what I wrote there makes sense. But here I'm just going to focus on one of the other meanings, and that is on this one here, on technological development. So the idea that ecological sustainability will be achieved through technological development primarily or even exclusively is the basis of what's called eco-modernism. And so eco-modernists will typically cite increases in efficiency, of which technological development is one kind. And so they'll say, for example, okay, well, we used to use X amount of resources to produce Y product or service, and now, because of technological development, we only use half of resource X to produce Y product or service. And these sorts of arguments are piled up in case after case to present the idea that it is, as I say, primarily or even exclusively through this means that we're going to achieve this. And while these statistics are impressive, there are nonetheless some fundamental problems with the argument that technological development, independent of resource use, is going to conduce to ecological sustainability. So firstly, and I think most obviously, is that despite the centuries of technological development that we've had, environmental degradation continues. There's no evidence on any meaningful scale that technological development is reducing humans' impact on the environment. If anything, it's just doing the opposite. And secondly, there's a reason for this, and it's called the rebound effect, which describes any situation in which the reduction in resource use due to efficiency gains is lower than what is expected. And the reason for that, as economists tell us, is that these efficiency gains lead to lower costs of production and consumption. And when things are cheap, people produce and consume more. And so, anyway, there's a lot more that can be said about this, but to stay on time, I'll just stop there. But the point is that to achieve ecological sustainability, collectively limiting resource use has to take priority over technological development. And as a final comment, I think the results of this research are important because they provide a language and an awareness of what these two terms mean to young people, and which allows us as educators to focus on those which best address our goals. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. And now I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. 5 minutes. Fine. Just on time. Thank you. Any questions, comments?
I do have a question. So economic growth is going to be supported by increasing resource use, and ecological sustainability by limiting resource use. Do you have an example of what does it mean? So,
you mean the resource use conflict?
Yes. So,
yes.
like, how to achieve both, like, to increase economic growth, but also to.
I can't think of any. That's the whole point. Is that
Yeah.
that there is a conflict here, and that they are not compatible, and that's That's the whole point, is that, and I think, if I understood what you said correctly, I don't think that these can be achieved. I don't think that you can increase and limit resource use at the same time. That's why I'm saying that these are in conflict. But like I said, if these two processes mean something else, it's possible that, and I gave a couple of examples, that they will not see a conflict. That's the whole point. But for us as environmental and sustainability educators, I think we should focus on these means. And if you read in the paper, and the other paper, the theoretical model that's cited in the abstract, I go into some more detail. I put some diagrams as well, which help to explain it. Does that address?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. Any other questions?
I appreciate what you're saying about like that conflict. I was thinking technological development. Can you think of examples, like notwithstanding what you said about like the centuries of technological development haven't demonstrated any increase in ecological sustainability. It's been in terms of a global span, it's accelerating the environmental degradation. But what examples of the positive that the students saw where technological development has in individual areas improved ecological sustainability?
Like on the micro level?
Yeah, like it might be at a state level, or it might even be a local environment level.
So you mean that came out of the study itself?
Not necessarily, like just the students are thinking that technological development can promote ecological sustainability. So I suppose you could answer it by why they thought that, or it might be why some cases where that is true.
Sure. So just to start with the study itself, the one example that comes to mind right now in my head was about the packaging. So one of the students, they were studying environmental sustainability, and they talked about in their class the design for the packaging that they were working on. But in that same blurb, that the same response, this young person also mentioned that they said, well, we are spending a lot of time in our classes, working on reducing the waste in this packaging, but I still think in the aggregate there's a lot of waste involved. And if you go into some detail, the point is that there are natural laws and limits that come out of thermodynamics that limit the energy efficiency in the transformation. So basically, you cannot create no one has ever been able to create a perpetual motion machine. This is this imaginary machine that you just push go and it goes forever without any maintenance or breakdown or energy inputs or anything. But to come back to your question, what other examples could they think about? Say, for example, like Tesla cars, right? I mean, they'd say, okay, well, Tesla cars are great, right? Because they do not burn fossil fuels, which is true. However, Tesla cars they're not manna from heaven. They don't just come down. They have their own upstream production processes, which require the extraction and refining and transportation and manufacture of resources. And then to maintain and run that vehicle, it also requires energy. And then because there are no perpetual motion machines, it will eventually break down and we'll have to recycle those resources, which also requires energy. I mean, recycling is great, or reusing is great, but every physical process requires energy, and that's got to come from somewhere. And in the last few decades, overwhelming 80%, in fact, of our global primary economic energy supply comes from fossil fuels. So it's slowly now dropping a little bit, but it's still predominantly fossil fuels. How are we doing for time? Do we have time for any more?
Like 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Does that sort of answer the question, to give some examples? Yeah.
But it did make me think of, wind farms and solar electricity, that students, I would imagine they'd have that in mind as being, well, providing to a continued decrease in fossil fuel reliance over maybe a century. So that would be an example where technological development might you know, really have a big impact.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm not, these other meetings are important, and I'm certainly, I don't want to give the impression that I'm against technological development, but the entire, as I said, in eco-modernism, they have a very myopic view and a reductionist view of looking at that little piece there and the increasing efficiency without looking at the aggregate system and understanding that it is dedicated to and based on growth in the aggregate. So it doesn't matter if that has been increased. And as I mentioned, because of the rebound effect, you, in many cases, we actually just use more resources rather than less, which explains why we live in the world that we do today. But despite all the technological development, we still have this ongoing and increasing environmental problems. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's okay.